When Netflix released The Other Side of the Wind back in 2018, a lot of people saw it as just another movie. But for Orson Welles fans, this was literally a dream come true. It was, after all, a never-before-seen movie from a legendary director who died more than 30 years ago. It would be like finding a lost Picasso or discovering a new Beatles album. And all it took was a little money, a lot of perseverance, and somebody behind the scenes putting it all together. If you're looking for the video game equivalent of this story, then let me introduce you to Clockwork Aquario, a long-lost Sega arcade game that was cancelled back in the mid-1990s. It was a promising side-scroller from the people who made Monster World 4 that hardcore Sega fans have been dying to play ever since it was axed 27 years ago. And now, thanks to ININ Games and an assortment of longtime Westone staff members, we're finally able to see what Clockwork Aquario could have been. But was it worth the wait? Well, that's exactly what I want to find out in this review. Before we even get into the story of Clockwork Aquario, we first need to talk about its troubled development. The game was originally started in 1992 by veteran developer Westone, who initially saw it as their swan song to the arcade market. It was designed to be a visually arresting side-scroller that felt like a more action-focused Monster World game that pushed the hardware to its limits. But what would have been a slam dunk idea just a few years earlier suddenly seemed outdated as Sega turned their sights away from 2D action games and focused their attention at 3D titles like Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, and Virtua Cop. This is typically where the story ends. I don't care how long you've been gaming, because I guarantee that we can all think of at least a few promising games that were cancelled and just never heard from again. That's just the nature of things in the video game industry. But not everybody was ready for that to be Clockwork Aquario's final chapter. After acquiring the rights from Sega, companies like Strictly Limited and ININ Games collaborated with former Westone developers to finish this long-dead action game. This involved everything from redoing the graphics to using the original hand-drawn sketches to complete boss fights. The result is every bit as uneven and outdated as you would expect. And yet, for fans who've been waiting almost 3 decades to play this game, none of that's gonna matter. The important point is that Clockwork Aquario is about to be available for the world to play, just as long as you own a Switch or PlayStation 4. As you would imagine, the story comes straight out of the 1990s. When the evil Dr. Hangyo threatens to take over the world, Hack Rondo, El Moon, and a robot named Gash team up to stop that from happening. The gimmick here is that these characters can slap the enemies in order to daze them, allowing us to pick up the bad guys and use them against Hangyo's robot army. We can also jump on the enemies and head smack them in the air, which helps to make up for the relative lack of moves. In fact, the only other noteworthy ability is a star power-up that lets our hero shoot a spread shot for a limited amount of time, making the game far, far too easy. Now, a lot of the charm of this game comes from the bright and colorful graphics. I wasn't prepared for the wave of nostalgia that was going to hit me when I played through the 5 stages, as each looks and feels like the type of action game that Sega was making back in the early 1990s. We jump on clouds and walk on rainbows in one stage, and watch the clockwork gears move in another. This leads to a ride on top of a submarine, and a mostly vertical stage filled with annoying conveyor belts. Yeah, we've seen a lot of these ideas before, but originality isn't the point. The variety is handled well here, and definitely feels like an arcade game that you would have played at the time. I also really like the character designs. Hack, El, and Gash don't just look unique, but they also handle a bit differently. Gash, for example, is bigger and lumbers around the level, especially compared to the much faster El. They also have multiple appearances that show exactly how much health they have left. When Gash is missing a head or most of a leg, you know that it's only a matter of time before he blows up. There are small touches like this for all 3 of the characters, adding a lot to the look and style of Clockwork Aquario. But look, when it comes right down to it, this is a tough game to review. It almost doesn't matter if Clockwork Aquario is good or bad, because a lot of people are going to play this game simply for the novelty of experiencing a long-lost Sega game. Does it really matter that the game is short, shallow, and full of cheap boss fights? For most people, the answer is probably no. This will be exactly what they want, an arcade game ripped right out of the 1990s. For me, well, I found the short length and simplistic gameplay to be disappointing. The whole thing is over too quickly and is far too easy, even on the harder difficulty settings. Had this actually come out in the arcades like it was supposed to, I have a hunch that it would have been quickly forgotten about. Even in 1994, dazing enemies and tossing them at other bad guys was old hat, and there's just nothing about the bosses or story beats that would have kept you hooked for more than a play or two. I mean, if Ristar and Dynamite Heady got lost in the mid-1990s shuffle, then Clockwork Aquario didn't stand a chance. And yet, somehow, this game probably works better today than it would have all those years ago. Perhaps it's because it feels like a novelty in 2021, or because the Sega of today no longer makes games that we're nostalgic for, but no matter what it is, Clockwork Aquario definitely scratches an itch. Sure, it's short and shallow, but who cares? Because it finally allows us to play a game that we thought we would never have a chance to experience. And for the few minutes that it lasts, that feels like a tiny miracle all by itself. After being cancelled a quarter century ago, Clockwork Aquario has finally been completed and is available for all to see. This early 90s side-scrolling action game is all about slapping enemies and tossing them around the colorful stages filled with gorgeous pixel graphics. But while it's exciting to finally be able to play this long-abandoned game on modern consoles, I was ultimately disappointed by the short length and easy difficulty. Couple that with the shallow gameplay, and you have an uneven action game that gets a tepid recommendation, mostly for the novelty and nostalgia. No matter what, I'm just happy that Clockwork Aquario is finally real and actually exists. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What unfinished game do you want to see released next? I showed footage of StarCraft Ghost in this review, but there are so many more. Some of the biggest franchises have unfinished games, and that's a shame. I'm excited to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back tomorrow with the 4th episode of Super Play's Top 600. Ooh, we're almost a third of the way through the countdown. I guarantee that this is the best episode yet. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.